So in this video we're going to talk about the structure and function of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You might have remembered it as just sort of the energy carrier in an introductory biology course, and what we want to do in AP biology is we want to make it much more clear what exactly ATP is doing when it is delivering energy to, say, proteins that need it. So what we're really going to do here is, this is kind of part one of a two-part video. I eventually want to discuss the energetics of ATP and the energetics of enzymes. So what is ATP doing to help chemical reactions occur, and what are enzymes doing, and how are they different? Because ultimately I want to argue that cells need both ATP and enzymes. I'm going to focus on ATP's role in this particular video. A brief summary would be that ATP helps make otherwise non-spontaneous chemical reactions spontaneous, or make it possible for them to occur in the first place. Enzymes are going to do a different job. My one sentence summary of enzymes' role is that they're going to make reactions that are already spontaneous just occur more quickly, or sort of quick enough to be useful for a living organism. So you need both, and I'm going to focus on the first part of this discussion here with ATP. So, is a chemical reaction spontaneous or not? That's going to depend on a variable that in chemistry we call G, or free energy. Your textbook is going to tell you more about free energy. They're actually going to give you an equation for that. They're going to say that the free energy is going to be related to something called enthalpy, and also related to temperature, and something called entropy. I just don't plan to go into this equation very much and use it. It's actually on the AP equation sheet as well, but I just cannot see how it's going to be used, because this is going a little too far into chemistry for our purpose. The only reason I bring up the equation at all is you're probably more familiar with the discussion of enthalpy, or delta H, from chemistry class. If you remember discussing reactions as being exothermic or endothermic, that was really related to delta H. And delta G obviously has something to do with delta H. It just also factors in a few other factors to talk not just about the total energy of a chemical set of chemicals, but also rather their free energy. And that's just not a distinction I really want to go into too much here. So rather than use that equation directly right there, we're really just going to kind of broadly survey and just sort of introduce the idea of when chemical reactions might spontaneously occur and when they might not, without going into too much detail. So for our purposes, what we're really just going to see here is, when we consider delta G, we're going to consider the energy level of the products minus that of the reactants. So you might remember that a delta is really a mathematical symbol for change in, and so that's why we want to do final minus initial, or the products minus the reactants. So that's really what we're doing here, and if we can sort of broadly know what the energy level of the product chemicals are and the energy level of the initial reactants, then we can compare their energies. And if we're going from a high energy state to a low energy state, I introduced this concept in a previous video, that's going to be a spontaneous chemical reaction. Just like we use the language that particles naturally move from higher concentrations to lower concentrations, we're sort of following that same dynamic here with energy considerations. We're going to see that going from low to a high energy state will not occur by itself, or it's non-spontaneous. So let's just look at, we're going to be doing a lot of energy graphs in this unit, and so you want to be comfortable with what we're showing here. We're on the x-axis, we're imagining some kind of chemical reaction progressing as some kind of chemical reactants go through some kind of transition. This is often called the transition state up here, and eventually become products then. And so here's the progress of the reaction on the x-axis, and here is our G here is our energy level, and we're not actually showing numbers on this kind of graph, it's more just the concept. So if the energy level of the initial chemical reactants is much higher than that of the final products, then you'll see this sort of overall downhill shape of the graph. So this concept right here, from reactants to products, this right here is what delta G would be. And in this kind of a graph, when you're going from high to low, we're going to call that an exergonic chemical reaction. That's another way of saying spontaneous. It's like we're exiting out of a high energy state. Another way of saying this is that delta G is negative, because remember that delta G is the energy level of the products minus the reactants, so it's going to be something small minus something bigger, which gets you a negative number. We're going from high to low. That's another way of really saying that the energy is released from this chemical reaction. If delta G is negative, that negative sign really indicates that energy is being released to the solution. And an example of an exergonic type of chemical reaction that we're going to study later is cellular respiration. By cutting up unstable sugar and oxygen, the sugar is getting cut up and the oxygen itself is rather chemically unstable. You produce much more stable products, carbon dioxide and water, so that's going to be an energy releasing process. Now again, if you're sort of wondering why is oxygen so unstable, why is sugar high in energy, those are concepts we're really not going to talk about here in a biology class. That's something you would discuss more in, say, an organic chemistry class later on in your studies. So a non-spontaneous reaction would just be the opposite concept. There are plenty of chemical reactions that cells need to do that are endergonic, that whatever chemical reactants are starting out the chemical reaction are more stable or lower in energy than the final products, which are higher in energy. That's another way of saying delta G is positive, because final minus initial, the final energy is greater than the initial energy. That gets you a positive number. It's like we're going from low to high, and so that needs energy. That positive sign really indicates the amount of energy that needs to be taken from the surrounding solution in order to make the reaction happen. And we're going to learn that a reaction like photosynthesis is an overall endergonic process. Photosynthesis needs energy to help make it occur. Okay, so we've at least defined the concept of spontaneous versus non-spontaneous. So let's see how the ATP molecule within cells can help make non-spontaneous reactions actually occur then. So let's turn our attention now to ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So that's a mouthful, but it's really the triphosphate that I care about. So that's the functional part of the molecule, and that's over here. Remember when we studied our functional groups, we see that this is really kind of our three phosphates right here. So three phosphates combined together, that leaves this other part over here, really this and this together are sort of the adenosine. It's actually a nucleic acid, so actually if you just wanted to consider this part separately, this is adenine. It's the same adenine that's like the letter A in DNA or RNA code, and this would be a ribose sugar. That's actually also in RNA. So it's really like a letter A in RNA code, it's just that it has three phosphates attached to it instead of one like a regular nucleotide. So that's the overall molecule, and the functional part of the molecule is really in the phosphates. And the reason why it's functional is I want you to notice all these negative charges in the oxygens that are very clustered together. Negative things do not want to be clustered together. Negative things repel. And so what that's going to do with ATP is it's going to make it a very unstable, high energy molecule that really is desperate to get those phosphates separated from each other. Or another way of phrasing that is that the hydrolysis of ATP is extremely exergonic. ATP itself is very high in energy because of all those negatives of the three phosphates near each other. And if it can pop off one of those phosphates, it would become adenosine diphosphate. Di means two. So there'd be two phosphates still left on there, but you're getting rid of a phosphate and all of its negative charges. That's going to be much lower in energy. So what we're going to see is that what we can do with ATP is what the College Board calls energy coupling. We can couple together the very exergonic hydrolysis of ATP with another endergonic process. If the ATP hydrolysis releases energy, it might release enough energy for the endergonic reaction to grab and make use of in order to occur itself. So if we kind of put those two together, then we can make endergonic reactions happen by giving them energy. So let's just dive a little bit more specifically into what ATP is doing. This is not in your book, and I want to emphasize it myself. ATP doesn't just sort of go near an endergonic chemical and just sort of cut off a phosphate around it. What it's really doing is it's directly transferring one of its phosphates to one of the chemical reactants or to a protein, let's say, that needs it. And so it's directly giving the phosphate to the chemical that needs it. So I want you to imagine some chemical reactants. Let's say 1 plus 2 eventually makes like 1 binded to 2. And that's an overall endergonic process. What ATP will actually do is it will directly attach a phosphate to one of the chemicals. Let's say we phosphorylate chemical 1. Phosphorylate is just a verb meaning attaching a phosphate from ATP. And that has consequences. That phosphate itself is very unstable. It's going to dramatically raise the energy or make chemical 1 much less stable than it was before the phosphate was attached. So what I really want you to appreciate is that the consequence of phosphorylation is it's going to dramatically raise the energy of the reactants. These are sort of the reactants now with the phosphate group considered. Maybe their energy level is now up here. And what I really want you to appreciate is if the old chemical reaction was sort of uphill, now the overall chemical reaction is downhill. We have made that old endergonic reaction, now it's exergonic because of that phosphate group. Okay? So energetically, that is what ATP is doing. ATP is energizing the reactants so that if it's a formerly low to high reaction, now it's a high to low reaction that's spontaneous. Okay? Make sure you keep track of what ATP is doing. ATP is changing delta G. It affects the delta G factor. When I discuss enzymes in the next video, please make sure you see what enzymes are doing. They are not affecting delta G. They're affecting something else. Okay? So obviously I meant to write over there. I forgot I was going to do that. If we add a phosphate to the reactants, it increases the G of the reactants, and now the reaction overall is exergonic. Okay, so here's just an example of phosphorylation in action. Sometimes proteins are the molecules that need the energy to complete a certain chemical job. So here comes ATP. ATP pops one of its phosphates off. It attaches it to the protein. That protein is now energized. It is now less stable. I know that sometimes students think of unstable things as bad. Nobody wants to be mentally unstable, for example. But chemically unstable is good for cells because that means that there's more likely to be a reaction or activity that occurs. So the phosphate is now attached to the protein. We now get ADP, and as soon as the protein does something, if it executes that job, the phosphate will then fall off. So if we want the protein to do that job again, it's going to need another phosphate from another ATP. Okay? So I just want to say that if the phosphate falls off when the protein, say, uses it, then is there any way of going back to ATP? Is there any way of regenerating ADP and sort of recombining that phosphate to make energetic ATP again? The answer is yes, but that reaction needs help. That reaction itself is endergonic. So how are we going to generate the energy necessary to regenerate ATP? I want you to really think of this as like recharging the energy source of your cells. I want you to think of ADP as like having very few bars left on your cell phone. How are you going to recharge your cell, as it were? As it turns out, you're not going to plug it in like you do your cell phone. Fortunately, we don't have to plug ourselves in. We run on organic compounds. We run on fuel. So if we, once again, this is kind of an energy coupling idea. We're going to couple this endergonic reaction of trying to attach a phosphate back onto ADP with the very exergonic process of cutting up sugar or other organic compounds in cellular respiration. Okay, I just want you to see that ADP and ATP are constantly cycling with each other here. ATP can turn into ADP whenever cellular work needs to be accomplished. So by transferring a phosphate to something else, we're energizing that something else, and we're sort of helping an otherwise non-spontaneous chemical reaction occur and turn spontaneous. And then when we want to recharge ADP by sticking the phosphate back on, we can do that, but we've got to have other processes occur that sort of deliver the energy needed to make that happen. All of these are pretty fancy words that we're going to see later in Chapter 9 and Chapter 10, but for the most part we can kind of think of it as cells have to cut up sugars or other things like fats in order to release the energy needed to stick the phosphate back on. Alright, so in this video we've tried to introduce one important energy molecule for cells. We've tried to talk about the difference between chemical reactions that are exergonic versus chemical reactions that are endergonic. One of those needs help. That's endergonic chemical reactions. And we tried to be very specific about what is the ATP doing when it's helping that chemical reaction. Go back to that energy diagram and you should be able to tell me what the ATP is doing. And then we briefly also talked about how ATP can be regenerated, and we're going to expand that conversation greatly in the cellular respiration chapter.